All right, welcome.
Oh, that was so sweet. Thank you for the time and effort that it took to produce such a beautiful introduction. My goodness, I'm having all the feels right now. So, to you, Sarah, and to the Connecticut Psychological and the Connecticut Neuropsychological Associations, I really, really thank you for caring enough about the things that I care about to invite me to this meeting and to also position me such that I could follow someone as brilliant as Dr. Andrews. I will be ordering that book today. There's a lot of continuity between our talks, and I will say that disability issues are so often left out of diversity classes, diversity conversations. And so to see us paired essentially here, and then with Dr. Lechuga coming next, this is just a treat. It makes it a really great Friday. So I am pleased to be here today to share with you some of my thoughts and reflections and research on infectious disease and neuropsychological science and how I see these parallel opportunities emerging. And I'll have to tell you, this is a very organic area for me. I feel like week by week, day by day, my ideas are expanding. So my goal overall is to unveil some opportunities to advance our service delivery towards brain health equity. I'll utilize infectious diseases, two of them, HIV and COVID, and then the climate of systemic racism, this increased attention to it, to show how these forces have led us to reevaluate a lot, almost everything. The methods, the price structure, so much about how we do what we do. Certainly there's significant impacts on psychological health, both for the people that we serve, the communities that we serve, and for our own households. Uh, the way in which we practice our clinical service, conduct science, and then lead policy. And finally, the final goal is to have moved you closer towards appreciating how the acquisition of equitable brain health and our own professional advancement requires humility and risk-taking, a lot more listening, and some reimagining. That's a term that it wasn't in my graduate study or my postdoctoral fellowship much, but I think right now we need to do a lot of reimagining, and thus we have. Financially, I have no disclosures. Like Dr. Andrews, I'm not making money here. I'm here because this is where my heart is. I do have authenticity disclosures though. And that is to just be clear that I recognize that we are practicing in unprecedented times. Here I am in my noisy Brooklyn neighborhood with my kid playing video games in the next room, offering a talk to this esteemed association. Every aspect of our professional practice is affected by the current socio-political climate. And, sorry, I'm just having a, I want to acknowledge my information sources. And so the content of the science that I'm sharing with you, typical players here, right? Published manuscripts and peer-reviewed journals, but they are inspiration sources. I have to admit that I have lost 6 people. These are all neighbors in this Brooklyn neighborhood since March. And the fact that they've met their deaths prematurely means that I'm up close and personal with the health disparities that are presented by COVID. I'm also inspired by the countless number of unarmed Black men, boys, and women who have been killed at the hands of police officers or people who act like police officers. And so the inspiration is coming together with the science to fertilize the grounds of how I do what I do in neuropsychology. I'd like to acknowledge the Manhattan HIV Brain Bank staff and participants over at Mount Sinai in Spanish Harlem. Their names are listed here. And then currently I'm at Queens College. Sarah, I didn't know that you were an alumnus, so that I'm just so proud to be on faculty there. I'm starting my 3rd year on faculty, and I've established a laboratory to investigate research on education, access, culture, cognition, and health disparities. We call ourselves the Queens College Reach Lab, and they have, of course, contributed to a lot of the thinking and the collection of data here. And so, like Dr. Andrews, there are a lot of parallels here. And so I hope that the positioning of our talks will really help to solidify some of these themes. I think it's necessary to spend a little bit of time in the historical foundation for where we're going to spend the majority of the time in the talk. And for this talk, the issue is in psychological assessment and how it was used against marginalized people historically. And my overall premise is that psychologists and neuropsychologists don't talk about this enough. Not only do we not talk about it enough, it typically is not included in the curriculum, in exams and so forth. But I pulled just one example. There are many, but this is one, Dr. Henry Goddard, who was an American psychologist at the turn of the century. He was also a pioneer of the eugenics movement. He studied the genetic causes of what was initially called feeble-mindedness, but he introduced the term moron into the lexicon. He translated the Binet-Simon IQ scale into English, very important, and promoted very wide distribution. He recognized the importance of norms and data collection and so forth. But then when the test started to be used to support the social structures of racism, he interpreted the cognitive differences on those measures as proof of the genetic inferiority of marginalized groups. And so this practice made its way to Ellis Island, where IQ tests were given to European immigrants who were arriving fresh from a long, tumultuous travel. And so in 1913, for a span of some years, Goddard led the effort, this testing effort, and for the establishment of cut points that could identify people who were morons and who would be bad for the still emerging American gene pool. And through this testing, the results, the way they interpreted it, were that 40% of Italians, Hungarians, and Jews who were tested qualified as morons. And so deportations for mental deficiency increased 5 times over because of the psychological testing. And so I think, again, it's important to start there and again, to just say it and to acknowledge that it's there and to be transparent. Because when the students, for those of you who are involved in practicum supervision or classroom teaching, your students will at some point become aware of this, and you want them to be able to say, oh yes, I remember Professor so-and-so, we talked about this and we had a chance to digest it and to talk about the impacts for right now, and to critique it, right? With a fresh set of eyes, look at the flaws. Knowing this history and having some fluency around this conversation then can help us appreciate reasons why some groups are hesitant to participate in research studies, or athletes who may be hesitant about having their cognition tested. There are reasons for these things. And so that's the background. My goal is to introduce or to bring your attention back to what health disparities are. That's a term that's utilized a lot, and I'm not sure everybody is on the same page for what it actually means. Identify some challenges and solutions to working towards brain health equity in light of infectious diseases. And of course, again, streamlining with Dr. Andrews, encouraging reflexive practice. I think that's my biggest goal for today. And so starting with health disparities, these are preventable, that's a key term, preventable differences in health, healthcare, disease burden between different populations. And the differences are almost always favored against people with marginalized identities, right? Because in our society, there are hierarchies. And so people who aren't, able, don't have the same abilities, or who have a gender identity that may be different from the one that the gender they were assigned at birth, or people who live in rural areas, or who don't have mastery of the English language. The odds are always against those groups. And so I do want to make a point here about intersectionality, that it's not enough to think about health disparities for people of color and for people who are disabled. What about people who are gay and also grew up in a rural area and so forth? So, and each identity just kind of adds to the risk for the presence of the health disparity and the severity of said disparity. And so some of the social determinants that promote and produce health disparities are things like racism or race-related stress, healthcare access, that's shifting with this introduction, not really an introduction, teletherapy and telehealth was present before, but it's jettisoned, of course, in the last few months. Environmental quality, you'll hear news reports about health disparities emerging from people who live in neighborhoods next to, say, the detrimental thing, the bus depot, the water treatment facility, so forth and so on. And then, of course, poverty, that's ever present. And so the National Institute of Health has formally acknowledged the importance of these health disparities, and a little over 10 years ago established the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities. So a full section of NIH is dedicated to the study and, more importantly, the eradication of these health disparities. This institute promotes the use of a research framework that I like to talk about every chance that I get, because if you're not already aware, I think that after becoming aware of this framework, you can never forget it because it's brilliant. And so they divide the levels of influence from starting with the individual, but leading to the society, and then brings attention to various domains of influence. So the biology, behavior, healthcare system, and so forth. And so again, if you're planning, so if you're involved in research, this is a fabulous framework to guide your conceptualization and the design of studies, of course. And so coming to COVID-19 and HIV, these are both caused by viruses that lead to what we're learning to be very chronic medical illnesses. And they are manifesting in America as health disparities conditions in terms of their impact, of course. And how we study and assess conditions really contributes to broader impacts. So I want you to think about how our framing right now will influence the education about this time in history 20 years from now, 50 years from now, next semester even. How our decisions and conclusions will influence insurance decisions, what conditions are covered, which are eligible for disability support for people who had been working but are no longer able to work. I see a lot of that in my private practice. Litigation, so where's the responsibility? Accommodations on the job and in schools, and then stigma, how people who are living with these conditions are treated by the folks that they're related to, the ones that they sit next to on buses and at work and so forth. So coming back to HIV, and I'll say I spent, like 16 years now as the attending neuropsychologist at the Manhattan HIV Brain Bank, and I'll come and tell you a bit more about that. But I just wanted to show you here that in 2017, this is data from the CDC, I believe, African Americans comprised 13% of the US population, but 44% of people living with HIV and AIDS. And in New York City, where poverty and HIV infection are co-located. So again, this is data from 2017 with the New York City Department of Health. And you can see the darker shaded areas here, like the Bronx, like sections of Brooklyn. And there are some discrepancies, but overall, poverty and rates of diagnoses are co-located. That's just one example. And so there was a time when HIV was a new virus, right? When people were scratching their heads trying to figure out, what do we do? How do we assess? How do we go forward? So when you think about the time span, this timeline of HIV starting in the 80s and then bringing us current, so much has happened. Thank goodness that there was such advocacy for HIV, because initially it wasn't a health, it was a differentially disparate condition. And so gay white men were at the forefront of those contending with the disease. And they were empowered to advocate for treatment. There were protests and things. And so in a relatively short span of time, you're talking 30 or 40 years, we've discovered an entire discipline of neuro AIDS or neuro HIV. We've learned more about the developmental trajectories, the comorbid psychiatric conditions, legal protections have emerged, anti-discrimination laws based on, medical condition. We've learned about what it means to be a long-term survivor. And so I believe that this timeline and the developments can serve as a bit of a guide for where we are with COVID-19. We are establishing a baseline right now. And so my experience with HIV really comes from the 15 or 16 years that I was just steeped in it. The Manhattan HIV Brain Bank is one site in the National Neural AIDS Tissue Consortium. There are 3 others. This consortium was established to collect very well characterized brain tissue, because HIV crosses the blood-brain barrier very early in disease, and the central nervous system serves as a bit of a reservoir. The medications that control viral replication are not able to cross the blood-brain barrier so easily, although it works in the periphery very well. So the central nervous system can be a bit of a reservoir for viral replication. And so human tissue, and there's no great animal model, right? There's a primate model, but it's just not that great. And so the need for human tissue emerged, and NIH established this biorepository. At our site in Manhattan, we've enrolled now over 400 persons. We've autopsied over 200. And we have a growing proportion of females, so there's very good diversity, gender-wise, risk factor-wise, and certainly ethnically. And so HIV has continued to be a major public health crisis, because even with long-term survival, there are a number of conditions that emerge, and lower grade cognitive impairment is but one of them. And with the shift in the face of HIV in this country, neuropsychological assessment challenges emerged, because the populations that began being those at the forefront carried a lot of sociocultural and medical and psychiatric comorbidities. And so it's made the assessment, or our understanding of what we're really concerned about, which are the functional outcomes by way of the mediation of neuropsych, very, very difficult. But it's also presenting a lot of opportunities for us to better refine our methodology, to reconsider psychometric properties of certain measures, of course. And so I believe that the HIV offers a lot of lessons for the study of COVID. And one of those is that there's a rapid adjustment to this disruption, right? Novel infectious diseases come unannounced. And in the case of these 2 particular ones, have impact on so many different levels. And professionals are facing increased levels of risk, not only in disease transmission initially, but risk in making conclusions, right? So we're kind of forced to be humbled again because we've become the students. We've spent a long time being the professionals, having all the answers. Suddenly, we have to admit we don't know very much. And some of us don't have much practice in admitting to or being so intimate with the humility. But again, there are opportunities that travel along with that, and we're going to talk about that. Let me look at my time here. Okay, doing pretty well. I want to bring attention to two, what I think are interesting components of the study in neuro HIV that I think will be similar for COVID. And one of those is the developmental cascade, starting with prenatal exposure, because we know that the condition of women who are pregnant, their inflammatory response, all of that has implications for the babies that they carry. And in HIV, of course, perinatal transmission was, and I'm happy to say was in this country, because in other parts of the world, perinatal transmission continues to be a problem and of a major area for like targeted interventions. And then long-term consequences. So once people are able to survive, if you, those of you on the at the webinar who are old enough to remember, people used to die fairly soon after diagnosis with HIV. That is no longer the case. It's now a chronic condition that can be managed well. So what does that mean for the long-term outlook of people who survive the disease? So an article that we published recently, led by a student who was an undergraduate at the time, but is now a almost an MD, in a study that had nothing to do with perinatal transmission of HIV. We were piloting a mobile app for cognitive screening in HIV that could be used in lower resourced countries like sub-Saharan Africa in particular. We were referred a small group of individuals who acquired HIV through perinatal transmission. And our qualitative observations were, wow, these numbers, these T-scores look pretty bad. I wonder if there's something going on here. And so we put a study together, and it was recently published in AIDS. So small samples here. So for those of you on the call who are students, never let anyone tell you that you can't publish on small samples, because you can if it's done well. We had a group of 13 young adults who were perinatally infected. We matched them with people who were the HIV positive and the same age, and then HIV positive people who were older than this group, but who had lived with HIV for an equal number of years, such that their brains were exposed to the virus for an equal number of years. And so we compared them on neuropsychological testing. What we saw, and the perinatally infected group is represented in the blue here, the years infected match in orange, and then the age matched in gray. You'll see the blue bars are the lowest, not significantly so across all domains. The cognitive domains are reflected here: global cognition, motor, memory, verbal fluency, executive functioning, the typical players in a neuropsych battery. And then T-scores here, which are corrected for age, education, gender, and in some cases, ethnicity. The perinatally infected group performed worse, again, across the board, but especially so on tests of verbal fluency and on motor functioning. Even more important to their own outcome, I believe, is that the prevalence of HIV-associated neurocognitive disease, also known as HAND, was so high. Almost all of them met criteria. Whereas in the age infected, the number of years infected matched group, only about 60% met criteria. And for the young adults who had behavioral acquisition of HIV infection, only about a quarter of them met criteria for HAND. So that was one study that just kind of emerged from our observations while doing another study. Here was another one that was not hypothesis driven, but important nonetheless. Published in 2018 on a sample size of just 2, we were interested in Alzheimer's disease in people with HIV. So the question was and still is, are people with HIV at greater risk for the development of Alzheimer's disease in older age? And so we had two of the first two individuals who died, and we were the first to document this neuropathology here. And we didn't even expect what we saw. Uh, this patient at the top was a woman who was 81 years old, completely independent in her ADLs. And look at this brain, right? You wouldn't look at it and think that it's affected by Alzheimer's disease. In contrast, in the lower panel is the brain of a woman who was only 52 years old. Now, this woman had a number of confounds in her background: traumatic brain injury, some questionable nutrition when she was young. She had low premorbid functioning, and the pathology was quite obvious from her brain. And so the conclusion here was that in the setting of HIV, Alzheimer's disease pathology can be as variable as it is in people without HIV. That's at least our initial inclination. So no guarantee that, all the brains would look like this one on the bottom. So really interesting and surprising study that we are hoping will inform future prospective studies. And so there's an advantage to small data and clinical observations. And with qualitative analyses, I propose that there is so much to be learned. Another example of that emerged from our observation of performance on an HIV dementia scale, where to measure psychomotor speed, individuals are asked to write out the alphabet. And then that time, the time that it takes to do that is then utilized to gauge psychomotor speed. I'm sure the developers of the test thought that surely everyone can write the alphabet. Well, in actuality, when you think about disparate educational experiences, this is not necessarily the case. And so here's a sample of one person, but there are many, of people who were born and raised in New York City, or at least one of the boroughs. This is an alphabet here where the person has just lost it after H-I-J. Here we have a double L, maybe a K-L-O-N-P, S-T-R-S-O-P-X-Z and Y. And we thought, well, my goodness, if people cannot reliably produce the alphabet, what does that mean for our tests that require adequate alphabet tracking ability? So the letter number sequencing test, the trails test, and so forth. And so this led to a number of research questions and clinical considerations as well. You have to wonder about the validity of the informed consent process, the appropriateness of certain measures, as I mentioned, the validity of the diagnoses that we reach based upon test performance on the battery. And then what does it mean for carryover into health literacy for people who the demands on medication management and tracking appointments and so forth is quite important to their own quality of life. And so we started wondering about the utility of the standard neuropsych approach to establishing premorbid assessment or establishing premorbid ability through a reading test. And we thought, well, if HIV can compromise central nervous system functioning, maybe assessing someone's ability to read words from a list after they've been living with the disease for 10 years is not so valid, because there could be degradation in that ability, perhaps. And so, again, a project led by a student, we published, this was in 2015, wondering about how stable it is among people who are ethnically diverse and who have starting points at various places on the normal curve of reading ability. And so we took about 100 people, or about 88 people, over the span of as long as 10 years. So we said, everybody is administered this test at baseline. We will re-administer it 12 months or how at whatever point the person is in their position in the study, and then see how closely related those two scores are. And then what I'm going to share with you is my most favorite graph ever, uh, because it's rare for data to fall out so beautifully. The RAT3 reading recognition test showed exceptional reliability over, again, as long as 120 months. Some of the scores were identical to the T. And so we thought, wow, well, we have some increased faith in establishing premorbid function. This doesn't fully answer the question. This answers reliability, not so much the question that prompted the entire study, but I think it does speak to it. Because if after 10 years, even after 5 years, if people perform similarly on a test, then it's safe to trust that the construct that you're measuring, hasn't changed, and that the measure can be entrusted for that. And so in general, I think that careful clinical observations and assessments, whether they be research or clinical with people who are living with these infectious diseases, can prompt very exciting testable hypotheses and can lead us to expand what we know about neuropsychology and how we do what we do. Moving on to now to this reflexive practice idea, I want to bring some attention to brain health equity, which is a fairly new term, and it can be defined as the fair distribution of brain health determinants, outcomes, and resources within and between segments of the population, regardless of where a person's identity falls in this socially constructed hierarchy that we have in America. And so some of the challenges to achieving brain health equity that may come up for some of us could be fear, right? Dr. Andrews spoke to how we have to just like face it and just ask, like acknowledge our discomfort, but then bring it up with either the person that we're working with some colleagues, with the literature, right? The scientific literature is very enriched on these issues. It could be better, but they're emerging pockets that deserve a very close read through. Some of us are so ignorant that we are steeped in the fear, right? And a lot of mistakes can come from this. And some of us feel like we just don't have access. Like, we may feel as though, wow, I would do a lot more for English language learners, but there aren't any, in my immediate community. Well, the good news is that there are plenty of opportunities. I have found that most community organizations welcome partnerships with professionals, even if it's once or twice a year, offering psychoeducational talks, offering to support a family through the read through a neuropsych report in the case of a family who suspects that their child might have a learning disability. There's a lot of advocacy that we can do within our professional circles, so that talks like these that you're participating in today are par for the course, right? It won't be unusual for such talks to be offered. And we can advocate for increased and supported training of diverse bodies of professionals. Some of the service delivery examples, I've mentioned this community partnership, even the donation of an exam. If we all donated one examination per year to a person who stood in need for it because they needed accommodations or family needed clarity on the elder loved ones, projected trajectory. If every neuropsychologist donated one neuropsych evaluation and a report, I am certain that that would have an impact on brain health equity, of course. We can also, those of us who have a foot in science, can conduct very high quality disparities research, being careful about the crafting of our questions and not do what a student of mine recently called a Frankenstein approach, where, oh, diversity and race-related stress, these are buzzwords. Let's slap those onto our existing protocol and apply for money. No, that's actually offensive, and that's not contributing to high quality disparities research, but there are ways to do it. I bring you back to the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities, where there are countless numbers of worksheets, resources, all there and available to us all. And I had just mentioned the importance and avenues for increased advocacy, of course. I will share a few research examples that I'm excited about. My colleagues and I have recently received funding for conferences that will follow the Super Bowl, if we get back to that point in this country where we're gathering for Super Bowl, but one that focused on increasing the representation of Black men in aging research. So this is with Robert Turner, who's a former athlete himself, Carl Hill, and Monica Rivera-Mint. This is a multiple PI design. And then over at Mount Sinai, we've received R01 funding for the study of aging in Latinx persons for understanding dementia and HIV, where there's going to be neuroimaging, genetics, sociocultural assessment, cognitive assessment, psychiatric assessment, and so forth. So we're looking to answer more questions, of course. And then finally, yes, good. I want to share with you all that neuropsychological journals are doing a lot more to address these issues. The clinical neuropsychologist, TCN, has a special section that's devoted to these issues. They've cultivated experts who can review articles. And so in 2021, I forget which month, it's available for pre-review. Dr. Jeffrey Corey has written a piece on white privilege in neuropsychology. Strongly encourage you to read it. And the editors invited myself, Karen Postal, and Javier Cajigas to write commentaries on those. And it was really something for me as an African-American neuropsychologist to have the opportunity to write about issues that I've never written about in public scholarly, forward-facing articles before. So this is new for our discipline, but I am certain that it will advance the conversations and hopefully our practice. I believe that the slides will be available to people in attendance, so I'm not going to go through all of these tips or directives on ways in which you can increase your cultural competence as it relates to race and ethnicity, but also to geographic location, to the host of marginalized identities that exist here. Because I want to leave some time for conversation if there is some, and I hope there is. So remember, COVID and social justice movements offer, I believe, paralleled openings for doors for us to return to being humble, to produce novel science, to shift our practice in ways that meet the needs of more people in the communities that we serve. And they give us opportunities for advocacy, because it's very easy to continue doing what we've done all along, just this rote kind of administration. And then occasionally things come that shakes it all up and really pushes us towards something different. So in conclusion, I like to make a plug for Grace for reminding us all that we need to give ourselves some grace, give our trainees, our colleagues. Thankfully, it looks like I'll get through this talk without an interruption from a neighbor playing music that happened in my last talk. But I just asked for grace because this is what it is. We're practicing from our homes. Remember that health disparities are created by social disadvantage, which means that we can address the social disadvantages and then eradicate the health disparities. The challenges that come along with us adjusting to these conditions can bring about a host of opportunities. And it is possible, even though we haven't been trained in it and we may not have a lot of practice in it, it is absolutely possible to infuse social justice into the work that we do as neuropsychologists. And with that, I will stop screen sharing and say thank you very much for your time and attention.
Wow, thank you. That was amazing. And you're right, I think the back-to-back between Erin and you was really, really informative and working towards maybe being intersectional.
I hope so.
Yeah, no, that was fantastic. So clear, so helpful. I'm going to open it up to see, we have a little time if there's any questions from folks. I'll give people a minute. It seems to take them a minute to formulate questions and their thoughts.
Yeah, it does for me too.
John, are there any on your end?
No questions have come up yet, so I'll just throw one out there while we're waiting.
Great.
Recently, Trump has put out an executive order to withhold funding for federal agencies that are teaching, particularly on the issue of white privilege. And I've been thinking about the effect this is going to have, especially as VAs are one of the main training for clinical psychologists and neuropsychologists at the internship and fellowship level that are APA accredited, that require evidence-based training on issues like white privilege. I wonder if you might have some insight into how to respond to this kind of crisis.
Ooh, that's a good one. It really is. I was so steeped in my own emotional response, and that's been the case over the last 6 months. And I had not thought about that, but what comes to mind immediately, and this may be different from what emerges, in the hour or so after the talk, but just workarounds that even if the VA isn't requiring the training or offering it during hours, I wonder if guild associations can be created for the staff that are independent of the organization, where such training can be encouraged or offered for those who choose to participate. But I don't, aside from that initial idea, I don't know how institutions can, at an institutional level, which is something I advocate for, work around such a mandate as that. I'm curious if any people in the audience may have some ideas for things that are happening currently in your settings, or what's kind of coming out of conversations with colleagues. Anybody?
There's no comments yet.
Yeah. I mean, eventually, of course, the hope would be that we could change the law, right? But that will take a while. But it may come next year. We'll see.
And I think work such as yours, producing literature that is describing these issues, will be so important for shaping that conversation.
I hope so. For people who respect science, it will.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's the key.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing
Okay.
So thank you very, very much.
Yes, it was my pleasure. And I'll be around. I'm here for the other talk as well.
Okay.
Thank you.